Good morning, class. My name is Mr. Kavarovics. I'm here from Project FDL. You are here for FDL-3 101. Okay, so you got yourself a brandy new shiny FDL-3, but you're not really sure how to work it, or you just want to know more about what's going on inside this thing. So today I have Jackie's FDL-3. I actually have mine taken apart in hopes of doing a build video, which will include a lot of maintenance and things about how to change parts out or whatnot. So I'm not going to cover a lot of that in this video. First thing first, it might not hurt to do a little bit of an anatomy lesson of an FDL-3. So you have your upper and lower cowls. You have your two caps, this one being the mid, this one being the rear. The mid cap comes off via these two thumb screws on either side, and that is your battery compartment underneath there. Down here you have your front grip. There are two different versions at the time of this filming. This is the mag gripper version, and there is another version called the hip shooter, which comes up to about here, and you would hold higher up on the blaster, hence a hip shot. Down here you have your mag release. There are actually two mag releases on an FDL-3. There is your usual lever, and then there's the paddle mag release in the back. If you notice, these two are actually tied together, so pushing the back will push the front as well. You can use them interchangeably or at the same time. Handle, trigger, stock attachment should fit most if not all third-party and Nerf stocks. And then on the back we have your three quick action buttons. We'll get into what those do later. Here you have your power switch, your screen, which is the screen on the MicroView microcontroller, and your control knob. Cool, so let's talk about how to get a battery into this thing. Okay, to get the battery in, we are going to put this on our handy dandy stand. And like I mentioned before, there are thumb screws on either side. When you put this back together, there is no need to over tighten the thumb screws, or you may have trouble untightening them later. They just need to be snug on there, just enough to hold this cap in place, and try to not lose those too. Once you get the thumb screws out, this middle cap comes open. Now this middle cap has nuts embedded in these spots on the print. Considering those thumb screws are going to go in and out of this piece multiple times, so don't worry about stripping this plastic out here because you're actually screwing into metal. Now once you get that off, the main power lead from the blaster sits right here. So it comes out from underneath in the front. The first thing you want to do, and I had this before, but you want to take this and kind of double it over and stuff your excess up inside this chamber up here, which will leave your connector hanging out. Now your battery, and these are the batteries that we suggest. This is the Turnigy Nanotech 1500 milliamp hour 35 to 70C discharge battery. So there are lots of other batteries that will work. I'm not going to get into the formulas of figuring out which batteries necessarily work and which don't. Feel free to Google about that. There's lots of information on all of the Nerf groups and forums and everything. This one happens to perform really well for the size that it is, and I have basically designed every FDL around this particular battery. So this is our go-to battery. I'm going to put this in with the lead on the battery facing towards the back of the blaster. And there's a little crevice in here that you can use to stuff your balance wire in. Once you do that, the cable runs over the top of the battery, and you can connect to your connector there. Now, when you go to put your cap back on, there are two ways to know which way is forward and which way is back. One, this corner on the front of this cap has a small notch out of it, so that goes forward. The other thing too is the end of this rail has an angle at the end, and that goes towards the back of the blaster. So that just slides on here. As long as your cable goes over the top of the battery and you don't have any wires or anything hanging out in there, this should easily slip back into place. You shouldn't have to force this down. As a matter of fact, don't do that, because there's a good chance you could be pushing something down that's going to pierce the battery. Okay, once we get that in place, put the thumb screws back on. And we can boot her up. Now let's take a close look at what's going on this screen. Okay, so here we are up close. Once again, here's your power switch up here. Here's your screen, and here's your control knob. First things first, let's boot it up. So power on is always towards the side of the line. As you saw, there was the FDL-3 boot up screen and then the 3 beeps at the end of the boot up sequence. Those 3 beeps tell you that the blaster has booted up properly. Now when the screen first comes on, this meter and that number are both your battery level. So a lot of what we're going to look at is applicable to the FDL2X as well. There are some differences between the two. I'll try to point those out as we go. On the FDL2X, this is the only meter you have. On the FDL3, I removed the ammo counter from the system and put the volt level of the actual LiPo there instead. The blaster will start beeping around 11.1 to 11.2, and around 10.8 or so, the blaster will cease to function. An alarm will go off that is pretty annoying, so you're going to want to shut it down at that point. A full charge on a LiPo battery is 12.6 volts. So this one is nearing, the lower level, but there's enough here for us to demo. Okay, so your first screen here is your speed level. So your speed determines how fast or how hard the blaster shoots. This is a value from 0 to 100. 0 will get you roughly 100 FPS. 100% I have seen with just the right darts and a perfectly full battery in all situations perfect. I have seen 185 out of an FDL-3. You are more likely to see with roughly used darts and whatnot about 165 average, and then with highs of about 175-ish. Okay, so to get into the menus, you click the button down. Let's walk through all the different menus there are. I'm going to explain some as we go, and then I'm going to explain more later in the video. So we looked at speed. Next up is rate of fire. So rate of fire is the speed from dart to dart that the blaster fires. So this is, full auto or burst mode. If we click again, it goes into the rate of fire setting. A setting of 0 is about 4 to 5 darts a second. A setting of 100% is the proverbial dart hose of about 12 to 13 a second. And then you have all of the values in between there. Click again to get back into the menu. Next up we have burst. Burst, you have 4 different options. You have a single burst, which would be semi-auto. You have 2 darts or 3 dart burst. And then your last choice is full auto. Okay, next up is min spin and max spin. I am not going to go over these right now. I'm going to go over these after we finish going through this entire menu. Min speed and max speed. So min speed and max speed act as governors on either side, or caps. So if I set max speed for say 72, and then I go back to the speed setting, it won't let me turn the blaster up past 72. If I turn that back up to 100, and I go back to speed, it will go all the way up. The same is true for min speed as well. It's just like max speed, except the blaster won't turn down past that value. Okay, next up is button mode. This is new on the FDL3, and this relates to your 3 quick select or quick action buttons on the side of your blaster. Burst will cause the buttons on the side to act as burst settings. So if we put it in burst, we go into burst mode. The front button is 1, the middle button is 2, and the back button is full auto. Now these buttons on the side, if you click real quick, you get a very brief beep like that, but it's not actually doing. You actually have to click and hold and get that loud, long beep. This helps prevent like accidental pushes of these buttons if you have to hold it down for just that very short period of time. Okay, so then there is burst. There is rate of fire. So if we go back to rate of fire, the first button is 100, the second button is 75, the back button is 50. Let's leave it at 100. Back into button mode. You can go to speed. So these buttons become 40 is the back button, 70 is the next, and 100 is the front button. These are sort of arbitrary values, but the intention there is like full speed, kind of half speed, and then 40 is probably, you know, like 130, 140-ish. Okay, and then the last value of the button mode is your presets. So these would act as preset 1, 2, and 3, and it would just load those presets. Okay, next mode is fire mode. So this is also new on the FDL-3. Your different fire modes are safe, which is safety. The blaster will just beep at you when you try to fire it. Trigger. Trigger will actually wait to fire the blaster and make sure that you are holding down the trigger when you do that. So like a quick click like I just did not cause the pusher to push at all. The opposite of that is auto. So auto, even if I click the trigger real quick, it'll still go through the full cycle and the blaster will fire anyway. The same thing if this was in like 3 burst mode, just a quick click will cause it to fire all 3 darts. The last setting is cache. So in cache mode, the blaster will attempt to keep track of all the times that you have clicked the trigger and will fire those off. So that, as opposed to burst mode where you are in like 2-shot bursts and you're shooting 2 shots every time, maybe you want to kind of choose how many shots that does. So if your spin up is real long, you can pull the trigger 3 times, it'll fire 3 times. Twice, it'll fire twice. If you manage to pull the trigger 6 times as it's spinning up, then it's going to fire 6 darts. Okay, so that's it for fire mode. Let's actually leave this on auto. Then we have load and save. So these are your presets. So if we click save, you can scroll through and you can choose the slot that you want to save your preset to. So a preset is a collection of all of the values that are stored on the blaster. This includes speed, rate of fire, burst, your spin up times, your speed caps. Basically every setting on the blaster gets saved into one of 1, 2, or 3 preset locations. So however I have the blaster right now, if I go to 1 and I hold the button, it'll save it to 1. Now if I go to load and I go to 1 and I click, it will load those settings that I had just previously stored in the last step. So this is where you start to get real creative with your settings. You set up, you know, I have heard of people have like a high velocity single fire mode, and then maybe like a lower velocity double shot mode, and then another one that is, you know, full auto with a low spin up, so you get some like a real snappy feel to the blaster. Like there are a lot of things that you can do and save and store and recall later with your presets. It's a really valuable feature. Okay, the last of the few, there is bright. So this is the brightness level of your screen. This is a very subtle change. So like in a highlight situation, you probably can't even see a huge difference, but this could come into more play If you were in a low light situation, there would be a much more obvious change to this. Next up is sound. So you can turn the sound off or on. If I turn it off, when I cycle through the menu here, it doesn't make those beeps. If I turn it back on, then as we go through the menu, it beeps again. Now the last item in this menu, this is also new to the FDL-3, this is your info. So if you click into that, it'll just show you info about the blaster that you're using and which version of firmware you are using. So this particular blaster is using version 1.02. Most of the pre-orders that went out just have version 1. 1.02 is what is going to go out into the full production blasters. Cool, so that's about it for the menus. Let's take the blaster down and go over some of the finer details about things like your spin up time and your dwell and a couple of those other things. Okay, so now we're going to go a little more in depth into the function of the blaster, like what actually happens when you pull the trigger and the blaster fires. We talked about earlier how I didn't want to talk about spin up times. Now's when we're going to talk about them. So we are going to learn about the FDL fire cycle. Okay, so your fire cycle looks something a little like this. So this is a span of time. This moment right here is when you pull the trigger. This moment is also when your flywheels start spinning up. So you pull the trigger, your flywheels immediately start to spin up. That leads me to this. This is your spin up time. So on an FDL, there is no rev trigger. So you don't pull the rev trigger and then pull the trigger. There is only one trigger there. So what happens is you pull the trigger, your flywheels start spinning up, and there is a period of time, which is a very dynamic period of time, before the blaster actually starts spinning the pusher and pushes the dart into the flywheels, thus firing the dart. So that happens right here. So after your spin up time, your pusher pushes and fires the dart. So this is your pusher cycle in here. We are going to blow this up in a second and talk a little bit more about it, but at some point right here, your blaster fires. Now, the time after this is called your dwell time. And we will talk about that in a minute as well. First, I want to blow this up. So this is a blow up of your pusher cycle. So this is your blaster has spun up. The blaster is ready to fire the dart, and it's ready to start making decisions about how many darts to fire. So at the very beginning of this cycle, there is what I call the auto cycle. So if you are in like a 2-3 round burst, or if you are in full auto. So at the very beginning of this cycle, the pusher will just spin and push as many darts as it needs to in order to satisfy your burst setting, or it will stay in full auto as you hold that trigger down. Right here is when you let up on the trigger. Shortly after you let up on the trigger and it finishes this full auto cycle, your blaster will break. Not break as in fall apart, but break as in like brakes on a car. So this will apply braking to your pusher motor, causing it to abruptly stop at the back side of its cycle. So that as the pusher is all the way back, you can pull your mag in and out easily. Next thing, I want to talk about spin-ups. So we are going to go down here for this. Now, your spin-up time, as described before, is the time between pulling the trigger and firing the darts. Your min spin and your max spin settings are what determine the length of this spin-up time to be. So let's create a little graph here. this is your speed knob. On the left side, this is if your speed is turned all the way down to 0. On the right side, this is if your speed is turned all the way up to 100. Your min spin setting acts on this side. So if and these are default settings too, if your min spin is set to 350 milliseconds and your blaster speed is turned all the way down to 0, this spin up time will be 350 milliseconds. If your max, this was min, if your max spin, again this is default, is set to 180 milliseconds, and your blaster is turned all the way up to 100% speed, this spin up time is 180 milliseconds. Now, let's say your blaster is set to 50 speed. There is a range that is created between those two, your min spin and your max spin value. If your blaster is at 50%, it's going to use a value halfway between these two values. In this case, let's say we use 200. This value halfway in between is what? 275 milliseconds. So if you are at 25, you're going to be in here somewhere. If you are at 75, you're going to be in here somewhere. The idea here is with the speed lower, it takes longer for your flywheels to spin up. So your min spin times are typically going to be much higher than your max spin times. Now, please note that this will go down as far as 100. If you go too low on this setting, the blaster will not have enough time to spin up before it shoots the dart, and there is a potential to jam if you set this value too low. You can't set it too high, it just takes a long time to spin up. But this low setting is something to consider. If you find that your blaster jams a lot, there is a good chance that you want to raise this value. Okay, so let's talk about dwell time. After your blaster fires and completes the full kind of fire cycle here, when you let up on the trigger, you have a 1 second dwell time. That is a period of 1 second after you let go of the trigger that the blaster is waiting for you to pull the trigger again. On the FDL-2, if you pulled the trigger again within this 1 second period, your spin up time is 10 milliseconds. I've gotten reports from pre-orders, and I've also noticed myself that these, what I call snapshots, so a snapshot is a shot within this 1 second period of time. These snapshots on an FDL-2 and the FDL-3 pre-orders tended to be a little weak. So I wanted to do something that made them a little more consistent. On an FDL-3, this time period actually creates a range of values. Sort of like this down here, but a little different. On production FDL-3 models, if you pull your trigger almost immediately after your last shot, your spin up time is going to be very low, roughly similar to this 10 milliseconds. Your spin up time builds from 0 up to your full spin up value. So let's say we have a speed setting of 0, your min spin setting is 350. That means at the end of this 1 second, your spin up time is going to be 350 milliseconds. If you pull the trigger again, say halfway through that 1 second, it's going to be halfway. So that'll be, roughly 200-ish. So the idea here is the longer the motors take to spin down, the more time they take to spin back up. I found this method to be very effective versus how the FDL-2 operates, and that's something new on the FDL-3. Cool, so that's an overview of the FDL fire cycle, and I hope that gives you a little bit understanding of what happens when you're pulling the trigger and as the blaster fires. So let's go over just a couple more things before we wrap up the video. Okay, so we covered basic functionality of the FDL-3. Let's talk a little bit about basic maintenance, and then we'll also talk about the speed lock too. So the FDL-2X has a speed lock on it. In case you're playing like an FPS capped game, the FDL-3 has the same thing. And we'll get to that in 1 second. So basic maintenance. The biggest thing that you would have to maintain, really, if anything, on an FDL-3 is your flywheels. You know, no blaster is unjammable. The FDL-3 will jam occasionally on you. When that happens, you can generally take something like a screwdriver or a pencil and make an attempt to push the dart back into the mag well. Obviously remove the mag before you do that. Generally you can push the dart back into the mag well and then kind of give it a shake and it'll just fall out. If that does not work, then we can go ahead and we can open up the cowls, and that will give you access to the flywheels. I'm going to put it back on the stand here. There are screws on either side of the cowls. And then these cowls attach to the front and then kind of fold on. You do the opposite. So once you pull this open, you have access to the flywheel here, and the same can be said for the bottom cowl. I'm not going to take these off, but if you take the grip off and then undo this, then the bottom cowl comes off, exposing this flywheel here too. So in the event of a really nasty jam, you do have access here to the dart a little bit, and then ultimately, if you really needed to, you can also access the flywheel screws and the motor screws here too. So basic piece of maintenance is to make sure that these screws are tight all the time. So every couple months you may want to open this up. Just make sure that your motor screws and your flywheel screws are tight. If you need to take them out and put them back in, I would suggest using the blue thread lock on all of those screws, including the motor screws and the flywheel screws. Cool. I'll leave those screws out for now. Now, if you need to speed lock your blaster, like I said, the FDL-2X had a speed lock on it, the FDL-3 does as well. To get to that, you need to remove this rear cap. When you take these out, this front screw is shorter than the back one. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to take this rear cap off. The best way to do this, because if you just pulled this cap, there is a PCB under here that houses this microcontroller. If you just pulled up, there's a tendency for it to try to pull that board too. So use one finger and hold the screen down, and then wiggle that cap back and forth until it comes off. Underneath the screen, if you can pull the screen out of its socket. Now, if you look, the screen on this actual unit is offset to one side. You want it offset in the direction of the blaster, so it would face up. Underneath this screen, there's this little red wire that hangs out. So this is your speed lock wire. Every FDL-3 will come with this small jumper piece. It's just a little loop of wire that connects these two wires together. In order to put this blaster into speed lock, so an explanation of speed lock is however you have your blaster set, at this time, when you put this jumper in place, we'll lock a certain number of those settings. So these settings include your max and min speeds. It will lock out your spin-ups, and it will also disable the presets. The idea here is it disables any setting that is able to cause your speed or your FPS or your velocity to go over a suggested cap. So now we have this lock installed. You can put it back where it was, like kind of inside the screen, or you can put it just in front of the screen, and then tuck these wires away to the side and replace your screen. Now, when I boot this up, it does the typical 3 beeps, but then there's also 2 beeps. And if you look close at this, In the upper corner there, it says S-lock. So that is an indication that you are in S-lock right now and your settings have been locked out. In order to undo this, in reverse fashion, you come in, pull that jumper out, tuck that wire back in out of the way, replace the screen, and then replace that rear cap again. So the idea is that the speed lock can be set, and then once you put the rear cap back on, it is 4 screws to access that rear cap. That should be enough that you cannot easily mid-game unlock your blaster, but it's not so hard that you can't do it on the sidelines and effectively change or remove that lock if you need to. So that's about it. That's a good overview of an anatomy of an FDL-3, all the functions, how the blaster works inside and out, a little bit of maintenance, and how to put yourself into a speed lock. As always, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to us on the projectfdl.com website, or send us a message through Facebook too. And with that, thanks for watching, guys. Take care.